What is up, guys? Citrus here with a quick tutorial for you guys on UI Toolkit and how to just make a very simple pause menu with it and give that controller support and all the nice things that go along with that. There's just not a lot of resources out there for UI Toolkit right now because it's still fairly new, so I had some trouble figuring this out, and hopefully this tutorial will make things simpler and a bit nicer for you guys. But without further ado, let's go ahead and just get right into it. Alright, so the first thing we're going to want to do, if we're creating like a pause screen for this scene, for example, we'll go over here to our hierarchy, and we'll want to create a UI Toolkit UI document. Thankfully, UI Toolkit is built into Unity, so you won't need to install it or anything. It's already ready for you to use, and we'll go ahead and name this pause screen. The first thing to note is with these UI documents, you'll need a visual tree asset for every single one of them for anything to happen at all, really. These don't do anything by themselves. You'll need to create this visual tree asset, and this is like the actual screen, so to speak, that's going to be appearing to the user. So I'm going to go into my UI folder. That UI Toolkit folder is actually something that gets created by default when you start using UI documents, and it will have the default settings that the UI Toolkit will need to function. So I'm going to go ahead and create another UI document. It's different though because we've created it in assets, and this is going to be the actual visual tree. So we'll name this pause VT for visual tree. And once we have that, we can go ahead, go into our inspector in the hierarchy for our scene, and we'll drag this visual tree asset into our source asset field here. And so once we start doing stuff with this, it will now appear in our scene. And speaking of, if we want to quickly open this in the editor, we can just double click this right here, and it'll bring up this UI Builder window, and this is where we're going to do all of our editing. Now, generally speaking, I like to full screen the editor whenever I'm using this, and whenever you do that, I've already changed some things and tweaked some things with UI Toolkit as I've had this editor open, but when you usually create a new visual tree, it's going to have some weird default canvas size, and if you want to change that, you'll just click on the canvas in the hierarchy here and change these values. And I use 1920 by usually 1080. I don't know why it was 1081. And then if we want to quickly resize this so that it looks exactly as big as it can, then you can hit Fit Viewport over here. Very, very useful stuff to make this as smooth and easy as possible. Now, the important thing about UI Toolkit is these style sheets. So we're going to go ahead and create one of these right off the bat, because this is what kind of allows us to make everything uniform with UI Toolkit, because you can have these selectors that will give certain characteristics to every object that you kind of put them on. So I will just say, we'll call this tutorial styles or something. And now the real trick with this is we will be able to add selectors that will give those characteristics to whatever we drop them onto. So I'm going to have one called header.header. The name isn't really too important. There is something that will be important with naming schemes, but we'll get into that later. So for now, you can kind of name things whatever you want. It's just going to have that dot because it's a selector, and then just whatever you want to name it. So I'm going to be calling header our first one, and that's going to kind of be for the big label for our pause screen, and then we'll also have one for buttons. And so now we have our two selectors. And all you have to do is just type the word here in this box and press enter, and it'll create that for you. Now, we want to have a couple of things in our canvas to actually display to the user. The first of which is going to be a visual element. And what I'm going to name this is container. And the reason I'm doing that is because these visual elements are just a fantastic way of being able to organize your UI into different sections. And we're only going to have one section because a pause menu is fairly simple. At least ours is going to be. But as you get to like more complex stuff, it's important to be able to have these containers so that you can divide your stuff up really easily. And yeah, just the more complex your UI gets, the more helpful this will be. So generally just good practice to have visual element containers for all of your stuff. And then we'll have a label, because we're going to have one thing saying that this is a pause menu, and we're going to have 3 buttons: a resume, a restart, and something to take us back to the main menu. Now all of these just have their default names. You can either rename them here by clicking on them and clicking rename like I did, or you can change them over here in the inspector at the very top. It'll have something for the name. So we'll just call this one pause title, and we'll name all of these accordingly. With your buttons especially, it's really, really useful to name them something preferably simple and easy to remember, because you'll be invoking those names in your actual scripts. So it's very, very important that you're making making names that make sense, and you also can't use spaces, so camel case is how we'll name stuff that has like 2 words. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start using these styles, and they don't do anything just yet, but we're going to change the styles, and then it will start to change anything that we have the selectors on. Sorry, selectors, not styles. But you'll click the word, specifically the word. Very important to do that. If you click other things, it might look like you're clicking and dragging them onto the things. You probably aren't, though. So make sure you actually click the yellow letters and drag them onto whatever you want. And if we want to check to make sure that we've actually successfully done this, we can look over at the style sheet section in the inspector, and you'll see under matching selectors, we have dot header for our label, and we have dot buttons on each and every one of our buttons. So that means if we go up here and start changing things about the selector, we will see that updated in the actual canvas here, because all of those elements now have these proper selectors. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to start changing the text to make this a little bit bigger. So we can go here. All of your different characteristics and stuff will be in this inspector. You can scroll up and down. There's quite a few of them, and I won't be able to go over them all and every little nuance with them. But font is pretty important, you know, being able to center stuff, being able to increase the size. And the size of our label is just going to increase because right now we have these size characteristics set to auto, so they're just going to automatically do whatever the content within the label needs it to be. And I'll go ahead and bold this just so it's a little bit clearer. And then lastly, I think I'll add a background just to kind of show off backgrounds and how colors tend to work in UI Toolkit. I changed it to white, but you'll see I have no background yet, and that's because the alpha by default is set to 0. So if you're changing colors and things aren't changing, it's probably because your alpha is set to 0. That was a little confusing for me at first, so hopefully that helps you guys. So now I think that's probably pretty good for our label, so we'll go ahead and move on to our buttons. The buttons are really, really wide right now. I'm not sure I like that, so we're gonna go ahead and change our width from auto to percentage. And the reason that's usually good is because percentage scales pretty easily with screen size. So now those are 25%. We're going to go to align to make these centered, and we'll want to go to align self. And that will make it so that these will now go to the center of the visual container that they are in. And so now those are looking pretty good for the most part. I probably want these to have like a cool different font. Let's go ahead and do that. I probably should have done that for the label, but yeah, that's the font I use for all my Spirit Seeker stuff. And I want these to be nice and big, visible to the player, so we'll increase the size for that. The height is changing because that's still on auto right now. And then I'm going to go ahead and also give a border to this because that is going to be helpful later. You'll see why. So I'm just going to change it to like a darker gray than the fill is. And we'll want to make sure that our alpha is set all the way. And it's there, but you can't see it because it's really thin, so we'll need to increase the width. And we'll change that to 10, and so now those buttons have a nice border, and they're looking pretty good, except they're really close together. So what I'm going to change is I'm going to change the margin. The padding will change the spacing within the object. The margin will change the spacing outside the object. And I'll set it to 100, and now all these buttons will be fairly nicely spaced out. But that's kind of the gist of how selectors work in UI Toolkit and how you can kind of use those to change some formatting. You can, of course, change things individual formatting, and that won't affect the selector even if the selector is on that object. So I can change the margin spacing for this to 150, so all of the buttons kind of get a little farther away from our label. But as you can see, that only changed the spacing for this one and not the other ones. But it still has all of its selector characteristics. The other ones still have all of their selector characteristics. So you can manipulate elements in UI Toolkit without changing the selector. But whenever you change the selector, it's going to change whatever has that selector. And one thing I'm actually not entirely sure of is if I were to change specifically the thing that has been manipulated on an individual thing, if I set this to like 200. Right. And so because I have changed the top margin spacing for that individual button, it is no longer affected by changes I make to the selector. So I could change this to 300, which is an obnoxious amount, but that one that I did change is not budging because it's been manipulated individually. So that's kind of how the selectors work and interact with those objects. And I think we'll kind of be done here for now. We'll go back into our scene and see sort of the changes that we've made. I'm going to quickly change this label though to say pause. Yeah, that's another thing about these. You can actually double click and change the stuff this way. But when you hit enter, it's going to do spacing stuff, so that's kind of weird. But you can also do it much more simply by going into the attributes and opinion. I always prefer to do it that way because the double clicking can get finicky. But yeah, I think we'll be done here for now. We'll come back into this a little bit later, but we'll kind of get this into our scene and probably start doing some coding to make this a little more functional. So the next thing we'll go ahead and do is double click out of this full screen, go back to our scene, and we'll see that the pause screen is now here, but we don't want it to be. We only want it to be here when the player says to, and we also want to make sure it actually has functionality. It actually has some code hooked up to it that makes it work, because right now, these buttons will do absolutely nothing. So we'll go into our scripts folder, whatever that may be, create a script, name it whatever you want. I'm going to call it pause tutorial. And once Unity is done reloading the domain here, we'll go ahead and add it onto our pause screen UI document. So we'll just click and drag, bring that over there, and then we'll double click on it to pull up our Microsoft Visual Studio. And this is where I'll be doing the programming for this video. So first things first, we'll declare our variables, get what we need. We'll obviously need a reference to the UI document itself because this will give us access to then everything inside of it. I'm just going to call it pause document. So that's one of the most important things. Another thing is going to be the private visual element that I'm just going to call pause VE. And basically what this is, or what it's going to be, is the visual element that controls whether or not we can even see the screen in the first place. And then this also kind of gives us access to some other things as well. It's going to be like the root visual element that displays everything. That might not make sense now, but it will in a sec, hopefully. And then we'll obviously have some buttons because all of our buttons will need to do their own thing, so they'll all need their own variable as well. I'm just going to copy and paste a few times and modify the names as I see fit. So we'll have resume, restart, and then main menu, of course. And those will all have their own functionality. And then I'm also going to declare a private controls. I'm just going to name it controls for simplicity's sake. Basically what this is for me, it might be a little different for you. It's my input actions asset. This thing right here, this is what controls all of the input in my project. It might be a different name for you. So even the variable name will change based on whatever yours is called. So something to note there. And we're going to need this in order for this script to respond to player input. And we're going to get that hooked up right away here in private void start. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to be kind of copying code over from the pause button script that I've already written, just to keep things quick and easy, and I'll kind of just explain what everything does, but I'll also write this, and it's also in my other one. I just had it in a weird spot that I didn't want to copy from. So basically, we need to declare a new controls, a new input actions within the context of this script. We need to enable it, and then we need to make sure that whenever the pause is performed, so it's looking at the input actions, it's looking under the player section, the pause, and then whenever that button, whatever it may be, is performed, it will call the pause game function, which we haven't made yet, and that's why it's giving us an error right now. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure we actually have our UI document. So we're going to say pause document is equal to get component UI document. Very simple stuff. It's basically just going to make our pause document variable equal to whatever the pause document is that it can find on the game object that this script is on. And it's on our UI document, so it'll find this pretty easily. As for the visual element, that gets a little more complicated, so I'm going to copy over from here once again. And bada bing, bada boom. Just like that, I have my code for this. And now what this is going to do is it's going to look at the root visual element of the UI document, and that's what this is going to be. And basically what that root visual element controls is whether or not the user can really see what's going on with the screen. It's the only way they can actually see it displayed. This controls a lot of other things as well. It's just kind of almost in charge of all the visual things going on. That's what the root visual element is. Kind of self-explanatory for the most part. At least I hope so. Maybe I'm making this more confusing than it really is. I hope not. But then the other thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to access the root visual element of the pause document once again, and this time we have this .q, which is kind of query. It's looking for something named resume, and it's going to get it as a button and fill our button variables. So I'm just going to go double check our UI document real quick, and our buttons are in fact named resume, restart, and main menu. So all of these names that I've used here are in fact going to work. So we'll have all of our buttons, we'll have our visual element, and we'll have our UI document, and we'll also have our controls set up all in start here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make on enable and on disable, because we're going to do some things here with the buttons that kind of allow them to work in the first place, and then sort of prevent them from working where we might not want them to. It's not quite as black and white as that, but it's pretty close. So what I'm copying here is going to be these register callbacks, and basically what this means is it's a register callback navigation submit event. So this is going to occur when, if I look at my input map here and I go to UI, it's going to look for this submit thing, and whenever this submit thing occurs on that button, it's going to perform this resume game function, which once again hasn't been made, so it's giving us a bit of an error. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I unregister these so that nothing weird is happening with them while the pause menu is not actually enabled. Now, with these set up, we can start actually getting into our functions. So I'll have private void. We'll do pause game first. We'll go ahead and get that one out of the way. And this one is going to be fairly simple. And I'm just going to copy the code. It'll be easy enough to explain. And what happens here, ignore that middle line, it doesn't do anything relevant to this one. And we'll change this name here. So this pause ve.style.display equals displaystyle.flex, that is what's going to make the pause screen visible to the player when this pause game function is called. And the adverse of this, which we want to call in start to make sure the pause menu isn't visible right away, is displaystyle.none. So displaystyle.none will be invisible to the player. Displaystyle.flex will be visible and interactable for the player. And then we're also setting the time.timescale to 0, which will stop time in the scene, which is like the simplest thing you can do to really pause your game. It won't necessarily stop everything, like some controls will still work. If you have a player that maybe has some animations, those might still get played, even if your time is frozen. So there may be more things you need to do in order to get this to work with your specific game, but this is the best thing I can offer for sort of a general template. So then we'll also have our private void resume game, and this one is going to be basically the inverse of pause game. So we can kind of just copy this code over, and we'll set it to none because once we're resuming, we don't want this to be visible anymore, and we want time to go back to normal, which is just 1F. And then after that, we will have private void restart game, and basically what this is going to do is it's just going to load the scene that we are currently in all over again, and it's going to set time back to normal. All of these things will want to set time back to normal. So I will copy this line of code over. Scene manager is what you're going to use to sort of do all of your like loading things, and we're going to load the main menu as well, so that'll be important again. And it's just going to look at the active scene and then also get that build index, and it's just going to reload the scene that we are currently in. And that is simple enough to me. If you have questions, certainly leave them in the comments below. That goes for anything in this video. Please, I would love to help you guys. That's the whole reason I'm making this in the first place. And so we'll set the time back to normal there, and then we are going to finally make our, I believe it was called load main menu. And this one is going to be fairly simple. It's extremely simple in my other script as well. It just needs to load scene, main menu scene. And what this was in the previous script was actually a string. So we'll go up here, we'll declare a public string, main menu scene. And this will just allow us to, once we are out of this script, go to the field and just type in whatever the main menu is called for us and our respective project. And me personally, I believe I set time back to 1 through my main menu somehow. I believe it's like when I start the game again. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to just keep things simple and consistent and have the time return to 1 once again. And so now this is almost complete. You'll notice we have some errors on both our player.pause.performed thing and our register callbacks, our navigation submit events. And that's because we need certain parameters in these functions for them to work, to know that they are the kind of function that's going to connect with whatever is calling them. So for this first one, for the pause game, we're going to need an input action.callback context, and I call it CTX. You can call it a couple things. Certain names might make Unity upset, but for the most part, you can call it whatever you want. For ease of simplicity, I'm going to just leave it at CTX. And so this is what you need in order for the input to work with it, basically. And then for the navigation submit events, we're going to have a little something called navigation submit event. And then once again, I'm using EVT. You can call it just about anything, but some things might make it upset. Like if you actually tried to flesh this out to event, which kind of makes sense, it starts to lose its mind. So best to just leave it as EVT, not make the Unity gods too upset at me. And yeah, I believe this sort of gets us everything that we need. So we'll go back to our scene, and we have this one field that we need to fill. As for me, my main menu scene is called main menu in simple camel case, so that's what I'm going to put here. And then we can go ahead and test this. Okay, so I might have cheated a little and tested this off screen, but I was able to find a couple things of note for you guys. One is that this script doesn't quite work as it was. What you'll need to do is you'll actually need to change the private void start to private void awake. And the reason you need to do this is because start and on enable have the exact same speed. And what that means is that these register callbacks will try to happen while these buttons technically haven't been filled yet. So it's trying to do something with something that doesn't exist. So the awake is just a little bit faster than start, and we'll make sure those buttons are filled properly before on enable gets called. And then there's a couple things I'm doing for my own sake, particularly with how this project in the player is set up. One is that I use this function here to deactivate the HUD, because if you have two UI toolkit things overlaying each other, if they're taking up the same space, you won't be able to interact with them. You won't be able to press the buttons. So that would have prevented the pause menu from working at all, because it technically exists in the same space as the HUD. And then the other thing you'll notice is just some like cursor lock state invisibility things that I do, making sure that the cursor is visible when the pause menu is, and then making sure it's invisible again and locked once I go back into gameplay. And that's just specifically how my camera and everything works. So if I go back here and start actually testing it, you'll see that it does finally work after all those things. I can resume, I can restart, and I can go to the main menu, but of course this won't actually load the tutorial, seeing this is the main menu for my actual game as it stands so far. So now that is all kind of working as expected, and it works perfectly fine with mouse and keyboard, but there are some things I'd like to do before we kind of finally finish this up, and it is things that will be necessary for controller support. So the last thing we're going to do, finally almost towards the end, is we're going to go out back to our UI builder here, and we're going to add some new selectors, and these are going to be important to indicate what buttons the user is actually going to press and being able to visualize that. It's especially important for gamepad. So what we're going to do actually is we're going to name it this selector buttons. It needs to be the exact same as the selector we're using for our buttons currently, and we're going to call it hover. And so what this will do is it will make it so that we have a special style that's going to happen whenever our mouse is over this particular button, or any of them that will have this selector. And we're going to once again make sure we're clicking the yellow letters and dragging it onto whatever buttons we want to have this new selector. And we don't really need to change a whole lot here. There's just a couple things I'd like to do. And one is to increase the scale. I'm thinking 1.25 is probably good, so it's just going to get 25% bigger while we're hovering over it. And, you know, honestly, I think that will be enough to get our point across. So for simplicity's sake, we'll go ahead and actually stop there. And if I click preview here, it actually allows me to be able to see what this will be like in runtime. And that looked a little bit strange because for some reason it didn't save the 1.25 I had in the Y there. Okay, so now if I preview this, our buttons will get bigger whenever we're hovering over them. And if we want to do this exact same thing, but for gamepad, gamepad doesn't use hover, nor do the buttons on the keyboard. This kind of only works for mouse. So we're just gonna duplicate this, and we're gonna rename it. And what we're gonna do instead of :hover is we're gonna do :focus. And this is how it's going to work for gamepad. So now I'm gonna go out of this, gonna go back to our scene, and we'll go ahead and test this. And I'll test it with the gamepad as well. You guys will kind of just have to trust me that it's actually being done with controller. I hope I've built up enough trust with you guys for that to be the case. And you know, if you don't trust me, simply follow this tutorial and you'll see that it works just as expected. So with mouse and keyboard here, everything's going just fine. I'm able to have those get bigger. And now, if I am using my controller and I use the D-pad, that's what I'm using right now. You can also use joystick. Joystick gets a little funky, and I haven't quite figured out how to make that not the case, but D-pad proceeds through it just as it would, and I can press different things. I can bring it up with the D-pad, or with the controller, with the gamepad. I have it bound to the start button, and yeah, everything kind of just works as expected with that. And it's all because of that focus thing, and then making sure you have the navigation event specifically rather than on-click events, and you should be able to have a functioning UI toolkit pause menu that works with gamepad, works with keyboard, works with mouse, everything you would kind of need it to. So hopefully this has been helpful for you guys. Thank you for tuning in and watching this tutorial to the very end. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. If I'm able to, I will try to answer those as quickly as possible. Thank you for the support. If you know anyone who's looking to continue working with Unity, specifically with UI Toolkit, please share this with them, and hopefully it can be a great resource for them, and hopefully my knowledge has been able to make things a little bit simpler for you. Peace out, guys.